Imagine a world where everyone dressed the same, talked the same, and thought the same. This was 1950s America, a time when conformity was the norm and rebellion was a whisper. But one night, a young man stepped onto a stage and everything changed. His name was Elvis Presley, and he was about to shock the world. Elvis didn't fit in. While other guys at the Louisiana Hayride radio show were decked out in cowboy hats and western suits, Elvis looked like he had just stepped off Beale Street in Memphis. He wore pegged pants, a flashy sport coat, and no tie. His shirt was open at the collar, and his hair was slicked back with long sideburns. He stood at the end of the line, hands in his pockets, looking as cool as a summer breeze. The contrast was stark. It was like he was from another planet, a place where rules didn't apply, and that was exactly the point. Elvis's appearance was as shocking as his music. In a world of oatmeal-colored khakis and drab olive greens, Elvis was a neon pink explosion. His bright colors, wild clothing styles, and daring looks were a slap in the face to the status quo. But it wasn't just his appearance that made people take notice, it was his music. When Elvis started to sing, the crowd went wild. His voice was a mix of black rhythm and blues and white country and pop, a sound that had never been heard before. His stage presence was electrifying. He moved with a raw, unbridled energy, rocking on his heels, rolling his hips, and shaking his legs. Girls screamed, couples danced in the aisles, and the whole room was alive with the energy that no one could ignore. Elvis knew how to work a crowd. He talked playfully to the audience, using suggestive moves and dancing wildly to the beat. He knew exactly when to hit them with fast tunes that whipped them up, and when to slow down with ballads and love songs. If any audience didn't warm to him immediately, he used every trick in the book to win them over. But not everyone was a fan. Critics called him vulgar and subversive. Church leaders damned his lewd songs and performances. Parents feared he would lead their children astray. Even some paranoid conservatives suggested that Elvis might be part of a communist plot to undermine American values. The irony was that even the communists were scared of him, calling him a weapon in the American psychological war. Despite the backlash, Elvis's sound, style, and appearance pushed the limits of American society. For many young people, he was a refreshing antidote to the buttoned-down, conformist culture of the 1950s. His music was a blend of black and white influences, a symbol of cultural integration at a time when segregation was the law of the land. His sexy songs and uninhibited performances challenged accepted norms, and his outrageous appearance defied the clean-cut look of the era. Elvis wasn't just a rebel. He was a cultural phenomenon. He believed in God, respected his parents, and loved his country. He was polite to adults and generous to his friends. He bought cars, houses, and gifts for everyone around him, spreading his wealth and happiness. He was the embodiment of the American dream, a poor country boy who had struck it rich, proving that with hard work and faith, anything was possible. Elvis was a walking, talking, singing Rorschach inkblot. People saw in him what they wanted to see: good looks, a new style, sex, rebellion, or traditional values. But one thing was clear: Elvis Presley was unique. He had a different look, a different sound, and a different style. He was an American original, and he was about to change the world. Elvis Presley's rise to fame in the 1950s was nothing short of a cultural revolution. His unique blend of rock and roll, country, and blues, combined with his charismatic stage presence, made him a sensation. But it wasn't just his talent that catapulted him to stardom. It was the perfect storm of post-World War II America. The country was undergoing significant changes, and Elvis was right at the heart of it. Teens and young adults were embracing a new culture, one that was rebellious and free-spirited. They saw Elvis as a symbol of this new era, a break from the conservative norms of the past. His music and style resonated with the youth, who were eager to express themselves and break free from the constraints of their parents' generation. Meanwhile, adults had mixed feelings. Some saw Elvis as a threat to morality and the social order, while others welcomed him as a fresh, exciting talent. Elvis's success was also a product of the new media landscape. Television, radio, and magazines were all playing a crucial role in shaping American culture. Elvis appeared on popular TV shows like The Ed Sullivan Show and The Milton Berle Show, reaching millions of viewers. His performances were often controversial, with his hip-shaking and energetic stage presence, sparking both outrage and fascination. The media coverage only fueled his popularity, making him a household name. Elvis's impact extended beyond music. He was a cultural icon, influencing fashion, style, and even social norms. His music brought together different genres and audiences, including black and white listeners, at a time when racial tensions were high. He helped bridge the gap between these communities, contributing to the growing civil rights movement. One of the most significant moments in Elvis's early career was his appearance on The Milton Berle Show in 1956. His performance of Hound Dog and Don't Be Cruel was a turning point, cementing his status as the king of rock and roll. The show was a ratings success, and Elvis's popularity soared. He went on to star in several movies, further solidifying his place in American pop culture. The media continued to play a crucial role in promoting rock and roll. Movies like The Girl Can't Help It, 1956, featured a host of rock and roll stars, including Little Richard, Eddie Cochran, and Gene Vincent. The film was a light comedy that both satirized and celebrated the new music genre. It starred Tom Ewell and Jane Mansfield and was a box office hit, showcasing the growing influence of rock and roll in mainstream entertainment. Elvis's rise to fame was a testament to the power of media and the changing times. He was more than just a musician. He was a cultural phenomenon. His music and persona captured the spirit of a generation, and his legacy continues to inspire artists and fans around the world. The film The Girl Can't Help It is a perfect snapshot of the rock and roll explosion in the 1950s. One of the most iconic scenes features Jane Mansfield, a bombshell in a tight black dress, sashaying down the street. Her entrance is a showstopper, with men unable to look away. An ice delivery man watches in awe as his ice melts. A milkman gazes down at her cleavage from the steps of an apartment building, and his milk starts to spill. Inside, a resident picking up his morning paper and milk shatters his glasses when he sees her shapely legs climbing the stairs. It's a scene that captures the electrifying allure of the era. The film's musical performances are just as unforgettable. Fats Domino, with his charming smile, performs Blue Monday, while Little Richard, in his signature frenetic style, belts out The Girl Can't Help It in a flashy outfit. Eddie Cochran channels Elvis with 20 Flight Rock, and Gene Vincent and his Blue Caps deliver a wild performance of Bebop Elula. The Platters, with their harmonies and choreographed moves, add a touch of elegance to the mix, dressed in light green tuxes and red plaid boaties, with the lead singer in a stunning emerald gown. The Platters were one of the most successful vocal groups of the 1950s, and their presence in the film underscores the diverse appeal of rock and roll. The rise of rock and roll wasn't just about the music, it was a media sensation. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, was at the center of it all. Newspapers and magazines couldn't get enough of him. Local papers across the country reported on his every move, from the wild reactions of his fans to the advice of local judges to keep it clean. Magazines like Time and Life featured Elvis regularly, with Time calling him. The sight and sound of him drive teenage girls wild. Even Cosmopolitan got in on the action with a feature story titled, "What is an Elvis Presley?" The media's fascination with Elvis didn't just benefit him. It helped spread the popularity of rock and roll. Every article, every photo, and every story about Elvis or other rock and roll stars contributed to the growing frenzy. Teenagers were hungry for information about their new idols, and the media was happy to feed that hunger. Whether the stories were positive or negative, they all contributed to the growing interest in the new music. Radio played a crucial role in the rise of rock and roll. As television began to dominate entertainment, radio stations had to find new ways to attract listeners. The solution was Top 40 Radio, which focused on the most popular songs of the day. Disc jockeys became the stars of the airwaves, connecting with their audiences and introducing them to the latest hits. These DJs, like George Hound Dog Lawrence in Buffalo, John R. in Nashville, and Dewey Phillips in Memphis, were passionate about the music and had a deep understanding of what their listeners wanted. They hosted record hops, emceed local events, and built close relationships with their audiences. For many teenagers, the radio was a constant companion. They tuned in to their favorite DJs on the way to school, at parties, and in their bedroom. These DJs were more than just voices on the radio. They were the gatekeepers to the world of rock and roll. They introduced listeners to new artists, provided behind-the-scenes stories, and created a sense of community among their listeners. The radio wasn't just a source of music. It was a cultural phenomenon that helped shape the identity of a generation. The success of rock and roll in the media and on the radio wasn't just a one-way street. The music and the media fed off each other, creating a symbiotic relationship that fueled the growth of the new sound. The media gave rock and roll the exposure it needed to reach a wider audience, and in turn, rock and roll gave the media the content it needed to attract readers and listeners. This dynamic helped rock and roll become a defining cultural force of the 1950s, shaping the music, the fashion, and the attitudes of an entire generation. Disc jockeys, or DJs, played a huge role in shaping the music and culture of the 1950s. One of the most influential was George "Hound Dog" Lawrence. Hound Dog wasn't just a voice on the radio. He was a cultural icon who inspired young people, especially working-class teens, to question the norms and expectations of their time. Imagine a guy walking into a diner in Buffalo, wearing purple peg-legged pants, and when a square comments, "What's this, a centennial or something?" Hound Dog just shrugs it off, saying, "He just doesn't understand, does he?" This kind of nonconformity was exactly what many young listeners were looking for. But Hound Dog's influence went beyond just being a rebel. He was a bridge between white and black cultures. In the 1950s, racial segregation was still a big issue, but Hound Dog played black music for white audiences, helping to break down those barriers. He would often refer to himself as the big round brown hound, and used jive hip talk that was common in black communities. His show, The Zanzibar, attracted both black and white listeners, creating a space where people could come together through a shared love of music. DJ like Hound Dog became as famous as the musicians they played. Unlike singers who appeared on stage and then disappeared, DJ were always there day after day. They were like friendly adult voices in the background, playing songs, sharing gossip, and running contests. You could even call them up, or see them at local events. This constant presence made them more than just radio personalities. They were part of the community. The mid-1950s saw a new wave of DJ, including Dick Boone, Jack Carney, and Casey Kasem. Their success was closely tied to a new radio format called Top 40. The idea behind Top 40 was simple: play the 40 most popular songs over and over again. Todd Storrs, the owner of Cow in Omaha, Nebraska, came up with the idea after noticing that people in bars kept playing the same songs on the jukebox. He realized that if people loved hearing the same songs repeatedly, radio stations could do the same thing. Storrs' idea worked. When he implemented the Top 40 format at Cow in 1951, the station's audience share jumped from 4% to 45%. This success allowed Storrs to buy more stations and spread the Top 40 format across the country. Other station owners, like Gordon McLendon, added their own twists, like instant news, where reporters called in with breaking news. The Top 40 format quickly became a hit, and by the late 1950s, it was everywhere. The Top 40 sound was defined by its fast-paced, energetic format. DJ were encouraged to be themselves and connect with their audience. Dick Boone, known as the Wild-Eye Tralian, was a perfect example. He was known for his high-energy, humorous style, and his ability to relate to listeners. He would tell personal stories, dedicate songs to local schools, and make frequent appearances at record hops. His jokes, even when they got him fired, made him a beloved figure among young listeners. One of Boon's shows on WKBW in Buffalo gives a good idea of what Top 40 radio was like. In just a few minutes, he managed to insult his boss, promote a concert, thank a sponsor, and announce the weather. He spoke directly to his listeners, making them feel like they were part of something special. This personal touch was key to the success of Top 40 radio. Top 40 radio wasn't just about playing hits. It was about creating a community. DJ like Boone and Hound Dog became folk heroes to young audiences. They helped spread the popularity of rock and roll by reinforcing its grassroots appeal. By the time Elvis Presley hit the national stage in 1956, Top 40 was already a big part of the music scene. The format grew rapidly, from just 20 stations in 1955 to hundreds by the end of the decade. Top 40 radio wasn't just a business strategy, it was a cultural revolution. It gave young people a voice and a platform to express themselves. DJ were the bridge between the music and the audience, making sure that the songs people loved were played over and over again. The success of Top 40 radio and rock and roll was a testament to the power of cultural democracy, where the music and the people who loved it were in control. The DJs at WKBW in Buffalo, New York, were more than just voices on the radio. They were like trusted friends to the young listeners who tuned in. In a way, they were like the priests of rock and roll, the ones who knew all the secrets and could connect the music with the people who loved it. Tom Shannon, a local radio historian, says that WKBW was the go-to source of information for young people. The DJs were like the Oracle of Delphi, the ancient Greek place where people went to get answers. They knew everything about rock and roll, where the artists were, and where they came from. But to be successful, the DJs had to connect with their audience. They did this by talking to teenagers who called in, taking song requests, dedicating songs to local groups, and mentioning high schools on the air. They also went out to events like record hops, bar mitzvahs, church socials, and dances, not just in Buffalo, but sometimes even as far as Canada or Baltimore. These DJs were like ambassadors for rock and roll. They helped spread the new sound to more and more people. Casey Kasem, a famous DJ who started his career in the 1950s, explained how DJs could play a song many times in an evening if they believed in it. This helped break new hits across the country. DJs had a lot of influence over their listeners. Young people trusted them because they played their favorite music and came into their homes every day. The song, Please Mr. Disc Jockey, by the Sensations even had a young girl asking a DJ to help her with her love life. It showed how much trust and connection there was between DJs and their listeners. By the mid-1950s, Top 40 radio stations were hugely popular. They attracted up to 70% of the listening audience in their cities. This helped radio survive the rise of television and even made it more popular. By 1958, radio listenership was up 25% compared to its peak in 1947. Time magazine reported that radio revenues were higher than ever, reaching $700 million in 1958. However, the way people listened to radio had changed. The radio wasn't in the living room anymore. It was in the kitchen, on the bedside table, and in the car. People listened while doing other things, like housewives doing chores. Local radio had replaced network radio, and stations focused on top 40 tunes, news, contests, and local DJs. This new form had helped rock and roll reach a broader audience, including not just teenagers, but also adults like housewives. Top 40 radio was a product of the 1950s, born out of the need to compete with television. It thrived because of the entrepreneurial spirit of the time, with businessmen and media moguls looking for new ways to tap into post-war prosperity. It also capitalized on the country's desire for new products and approaches. By spreading rock and roll, Top 40 radio introduced millions of white Americans to black-influenced music and culture. Despite being local, it promoted a nationwide hit list, and itinerant DJs crisscrossed the country, spreading the music far and wide. Television also played a significant role in promoting rock and roll. Shows like The Ed Sullivan Show, The Steve Allen Show, and The Perry Como Show featured rock and roll artists, helping to make the music mainstream. When Elvis Presley performed on The Ed Sullivan Show, the ratings soared, and other variety shows followed suit. Rock and roll was visually exciting, with artists like Elvis Presley, Gene Vincent, and Fats Domino moving and dancing in ways that captured the audience's attention. Rock and roll also appeared on amateur shows like Arthur Godfrey's Talent Scouts and Ted Mack's Original Amateur Hour, where future stars like Pat Boone and the Maguire sisters got their start. Even though some early rock and roll stars like Elvis Presley and Buddy Holly failed their auditions, television continued to showcase the music. Shows like Your Hit Parade featured the top songs of the week, but as rock and roll became more popular, the show struggled to keep up with the changing tastes and was eventually canceled in 1959. Television often presented a non-threatening version of rock and roll. Shows like The Ed Sullivan Show, tried to make the music and the artist seem more acceptable to a wider audience. Fats Domino, for example, was allowed to perform on the show solo, without his band, to avoid showing a group of black men on stage, which might have been seen as threatening by some viewers. Despite these efforts to make rock and roll seem less rebellious, the more people saw it, the more they began to accept it. The Platters, a black R&B group, benefited greatly from television exposure. Their popularity skyrocketed after they started appearing on national TV, and they became the first black rock group to reach the top of the national pop charts with The Great Pretender in 1956. By the end of the decade, they had 16 top 40 hits, including 4 #1 records. Television and radio worked together to bring rock and roll into homes across the country. As the music became more mainstream, it gained respectability. Hollywood noticed the commercial value of rock and roll and started featuring it in movies. The song "Rock Around the Clock" by Bill Haley and his Comets, used in the opening credits of the film Blackboard Jungle, became a huge hit. Elvis Presley's acting debut in Love Me Tender also attracted large audiences and made the studio a lot of money. Movies like The Girl Can't Help It and Rock, Rock, Rock featured multiple rock and roll stars performing on screen, drawing young audiences to theaters. Rock, Rock, Rock introduced new talent like Tuesday Weld and featured Connie Francis, who would later become a big star. The plots of these movies were often simple, but the real draw was seeing the rock and roll stars perform. By the late 1950s, rock and roll had become a cultural force, thanks in large part to the efforts of radio DJs and television shows. It had expanded its audience to include not just teenagers, but also adults, and it had introduced millions of Americans to new music and new cultural experiences. In 1956, the world of music was electrified by the rise of rock and roll. Teenagers were captivated by this new sound, and the movie Rock, Rock, Rock captured the essence of this cultural phenomenon. The movie poster alone was a visual feast, with a central image of a couple dancing the jitterbug, the girl's dress twirling up to her thighs, and the words "Rock, Rock, Rock" emblazoned across their bodies in bold red letters. Standing to the side with a sly grin was Alan Freed, the king of rock and roll, pointing at the dancing couple. The bottom of the poster hinted at interracial romance, featuring Tuesday Weld and Frankie Lyman, an African-American singer, looking cool and stylish. The movie itself was a showcase of rock and roll's biggest stars. Chuck Berry, in particular, stole the show with his electrifying performance of You Can't Catch Me. Dressed in a white tuxedo with black lapels and a bow tie, Berry's performance was a blend of music and dance, with his signature duck walk and over-the-top body movements. Critics were blown away, describing his act as a humorous ballet, and praising his ability to act out the lyrics with his entire body. One reviewer even said that Berry's performance alone was worth the price of admission. Rock and roll movies like Rock, Rock, Rock were more than just entertainment. They were a powerful marketing tool. They promoted rock and roll as safe, fun, and quintessentially American. These movies made money for producers, provided exposure for rock and roll stars, and helped solidify the genre's place in American culture. The arrival of Elvis Presley in 1956 only added to the rock and roll frenzy. Prislamania swept the nation, and media outlets, including movies, capitalized on the craze. Elvis's performances and the media's portrayal of him as a rebel with a cause only fueled the popularity of rock and roll. Meanwhile, the pop music industry was trying to cash in on the rock and roll craze in its own way. One notable example was K-Star's hit, Rock and Roll Waltz. This schmaltzy pop ballad, with its catchy title, became a #1 hit. The song humorously depicted a teenage girl coming home to find her parents trying to waltz to a rock and roll song. It was a light-hearted attempt to bridge the gap between the older generation's traditional music and the new, exciting sound of rock and roll. The pop industry also produced numerous cover records of R&B hits. Artists like Pat Boone, the Diamonds, and the Fontaine Sisters covered songs by Little Richard, Fats Domino, and Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers. These covers were often more polished and appealing to a broader audience, but something significant happened in 1956. For the first time, original R&B recordings started to outshine their pop covers. Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers' Why Do Fools Fall in Love reached number 6 on the charts, beating out Pat Boone's and the Diamonds versions. This shift marked a turning point, as teenagers began to demand the authentic, raw energy of the original R&B recordings. The year 1956 was a pivotal moment in the history of rock and roll. It saw the genre transition from a niche sound to a mainstream phenomenon, thanks to the efforts of artists, media, and the pop industry. The movies, the hits, and the cover records all played a role in making rock and roll the defining music of a generation. The mid-1950s were a time of big changes in America, especially in music. One of the most interesting changes was the rise and fall of cover records. Cover records were songs that white artists recorded to make them sound more acceptable to a wider audience. For example, in 1956, Pat Boone's version of the Flamingos' I'll Be Home became a hit, reaching number 4 on the charts, while the original didn't even chart. Similarly, the Fontaine Sisters' cover of the Teen Queens' Eddie My Love reached number 11, while the original only made it to number 14. Despite their success, cover records started to fade by 1956. By 1958, they were almost gone. This shift happened because African American culture was becoming more prominent. Important civil rights victories like Brown vs. Board of Education and the Montgomery bus boycott were making headline. Jackie Robinson had broken the color barrier in baseball, and Amos and Andy was the first all-black show on TV. Black R&B music was gaining popularity and evolving into rock and roll. White teenagers were becoming more open to black rock and rollers, and a 1956 ad from Atlantic Records said it best, "Covers sh, movers. Atlantic has the real hits." Cover records showed how American society thought and acted. They were a cultural battleground where new and old ideas clashed. When a new style of music, like rock and roll, emerged, the dominant culture often responded with a safer, more familiar version. Cover records were often watered-down versions of the original R&B songs, but they helped introduce rock and roll to a broader audience. For example, Pat Boone's cover of Little Richard's Tutti Frutti initially did better on the charts, but over time, Little Richard's version became the classic. In 1956, the music industry tried to capitalize on the rock and roll craze with Bandwagon Record. These were songs that tried to ride the wave of rock and roll's popularity without being too risky. K-Star's Rock and Roll Waltz was the most successful, but many other artists joined in. Georgia Gibbs sang Rock Right, Archie Blair had Rockin' Ghost, and Don Cornell performed Teenage Meeting Gonna Rock It Up Tonight. Perry Como's Jukebox Baby and Guy Mitchell's Singin' the Blues also made it big by subtly referencing rock and roll. Many Bandwagon records were aimed directly at teenagers. Gloria Mann's Teenage Prayer and the Chordettes' Teenage Goodnight spoke directly to the young audience. Sonny James's Young Love and Nat King Cole's Too Young to Go Steady both focused on teenage romance. Pop singers also tackled other aspects of teen life, like Patti Page's My First Formal Gown and Eddie Fisher's Dungaree Doll. Novelty songs, a popular genre in the music industry, also took on a new flavor. Buddy Hackett's Chinese Rock and Egg Roll and Barry Gordon's Rock Around Mother Goose played with the idea of rock and roll. Nervous Norvus Jimmy Drake had a hit with Transfusion, a funny song about a reckless teen driver. Jim Lowe's Green Door became a #1 hit by combining a big rock and roll beat with curiosity about what happens behind the mysterious door. The most interesting novelty hit was The Flying Saucer by Bill Buchanan and Dickie Goodman. It was a mashup of 15 different hit songs and a parody of the flying saucer craze. The record caused a stir when music publishers sued for copyright infringement, but it also boosted sales of the songs it featured. Buchanan and Goodman's follow-up, Buchanan and Goodman on Trial, joked about the legal troubles they faced. Comedian Stan Freberg also took a shot at rock and roll with his parody Heartbreak Hotel, making fun of Elvis Presley's style. These novelty songs not only made money, but also introduced rock and roll to new listeners, suggesting that the new music was just harmless fun. Even with the rise of Elvis Presley, pop rock pioneers like Bill Haley and his Comets continued to have success. Bill Haley, despite looking more like an appliance salesman than a rock star, had a string of hits. His See You Later, Alligator became a top 6 hit, and songs like ROCK and The Saints' Rock and Roll kept him on the charts. Haley's Rip It Up, a cover of Little Richard's hit, showed his ability to blend white pop with R&B. However, not everyone was happy with the rise of rock and roll. Critics called it mongrel music, and censors scrutinized its lyrics. Some adults were shocked by Elvis's performances and worried about the influence on teens. After a riot at an Alan Freed concert, some cities banned rock and roll. Bill Haley and his Comets tried to defend rock and roll with songs like Teenager's Mother, Are You Right? And Don't Knock the Rock. Despite their efforts, newer, younger artists were taking over, and Haley's last big hit, Skinny Minnie, came in 1958. The mid-1950s were a time of change and conflict in music, but they also marked the beginning of rock and roll's dominance in American culture. Cover records, bandwagon songs, and novelty hits all played a role in this transformation, showing how music can reflect and shape society. Bill Haley and his Comets were like the pioneers of rock and roll. They might not have been the coolest or the most talented, but they were among the first to bring this new sound to the masses. Their biggest year was 1956, when they had hit after hit, performed on TV, and even starred in movies like Rock Around the Clock and Don't Knock the Rock. Their music was a mix of country, pop, and R&B, and it resonated with teens who were looking for something different from the music their parents listened to. One of those teens was John Peterson, from Mason City, Iowa. He remembers the 1950s as a time when he and his friends were hip beyond our years, using phrases like Daddy-O and Cool Man Cool. John bought his first rock and roll record, Rock Around the Clock, by Bill Haley and his Comets, after asking older kids for advice. That record changed his life. He joined a band, and later played keyboards with the Pete Clint Quintet. Even though he eventually became a doctor, John never forgot how important music was to him in those early years of rock and roll. Bill Haley and his Comets helped make rock and roll more acceptable and safe for the masses. Their success showed that there was a huge audience for this new music. But they weren't the only ones who benefited from the rock and roll craze. Other groups like the crew Cuts and Boyd Bennett and the Rockets also found success, though their careers weren't as long-lasting as Haley's. The most successful of these early pop rockers was Pat Boone. He had 14 top 10 hits, best-selling albums, a TV show, and even starred in movies. Critics often dismiss Boone as a contrived pop singer who watered down rock and roll, but that's not the whole story. Pat's music was mainstream, and his clean-cut image appealed to many teens who identified with his traditional values. Even Elvis Presley, who was often seen as the king of rock and roll, collected Pat Boone records and said he admired Boone's voice. Pat Boone saw himself as a genuine part of the rock and roll scene. He had more consistent chart success than many of his contemporaries, and he stayed on the charts for over 200 weeks straight. His music introduced a wider audience to R&B, and he helped bridge the gap between the old and new sounds. Despite the criticism, Pat's fans cheered him on, and his music played a significant role in the early days of rock and roll. Pat's clean-cut image and white bucks were not a PR gimmick. They were just a reflection of who he was, a regular guy from Tennessee who was married, went to college, and went to church. When Elvis came along, the media often compared the two, but Pat's image as the clean-cut guy was genuine. He changed words in songs if he found them offensive, and refused to record some R&B songs for moral reason. Pat's music resonated with the mainstream values of the 1950s. His songs about marriage and romance, like I'll Be Home and Friendly Persuasion, appealed to teens who were still rooted in traditional values. His success shows that rock and roll was a melting pot, bringing together different styles and audiences. Pat, like Elvis, helped shake up the pop music industry and introduce a wider audience to the new sound. In the end, Bill Haley, Pat Boone, and the other early rock and rollers left a lasting impact on the music industry. They helped define a new era, and showed that music could be a powerful force for change. Even though their music might sound dated now, it was revolutionary in its time, and it shaped the world of rock and roll as we know it today.